The direct cause of the reddening of the sea was a great mountain burning with fire. The mountain was cast into the sea. For many mainstream scholars, this can only be a volcano. But within the framework of the polar configuration, which is the basis of John's symbolism, the mountain is something else entirely. Before we identify the mountain, however, we must first identify the origin of the cataclysm. John is quite clear on his point. He identifies the ultimate cause of the hail, fire, and blood as a star. Since the star moves and is quite close to Earth, it is, in modern terminology, a planet. John called the star Wormwood, since it caused the waters to be bitter, not to mention deadly. The word John used and translated as wormwood was opsinthos and refers to Artemisia absinthium. Wormwood is an herb with a bitter taste and has many useful medicinal properties. But John is not talking about the herb itself. He's using the herb to name a planet. The bitterness of the herb describes the property of a planet which causes the waters of the world to become bitter. The interesting point here is that John didn't need to name the planet as wormwood. He could have simply described the bitterness of the waters as he did with the bloody color of the sea. Unless the name wormwood had a known relationship to a specific planet and the revelator wanted to use the name of the planet to symbolically reveal the identity of the planet. Wormwood has long been known in astrology and herbal lore as an herb of the planet Mars. Mars is the planet that governs the plant. Nicholas Culpeper, an English botanist, physician, and astrologer, and pioneer in the systemization of herbal and pharmaceutical knowledge, had a lot to say about the relationship between wormwood and the red planet. In his famous catalog of herbs, The Complete Herbal, Culpeper discussed the connection between herb and planet at great length. In this short citation, Culpeper includes the ancient lore of Mars as a bringer of disease and pestilence, as well as the planet's restorative and healing power. We'll discuss these characteristics later in reference to the pestilences of both the Exodus and Apocalypse. Wormwood's connection with Mars and with no other planet makes perfect sense within the context of John's revelation. After all, the identification of the star Wormwood as the planet Mars merely supports John's subsequent identification of the agent of the apocalypse as Apollyon, which is Mars. The ancients universally called the planet Mars Morning Star, as comparative mythologist David Talbot points out. The ancients also universally believed that Mars, as the morning star, would one day return. As Talbot noted, Quetzalcoatl was the morning star and an avatar of the planet Mars. This flatly contradicts the Mormon tradition that the Aztec deity is a garbled version of the resurrected Jesus Christ. One of the legends of Quetzalcoatl relates that he promised to return in the year Sayatl, 1 Reed, which is the date of his birth and death. The Cheyenne of the Great Plains worshipped morning star called Matsuyoev. He, like Quetzalcoatl, promised to return. The Skeety Pawnee considered the red planet as incredibly strong and destructive. It had destroyed many worlds before the current one and would end our world as well. It would return to do so as the morning star. In January 1778, Captain James Cook came to the Hawaiian Islands. He arrived during the Makahiki Festival, which was instituted by the god Lono. The timing was unfortunate as the natives mistook Cook as the returning god. Though Lono was not the Hawaiian morning star, he certainly represented Mars. Like the other Martian avatars, Lono left his people but promised to return. The mythic prophecies will be fulfilled. Mars, as the morning star, will return. The planet will return in conjunction with the second coming of Jesus Christ, whom the planet symbolically represents. It was the prophet Balaam, living at the time of Moses, who prophesied of the Star of Jacob, which would come in the latter days. The Star of Jacob is the Messiah, and the Messiah will return, symbolically speaking, as a star, the morning star. The morning star, the planet Mars itself, will literally return with the Messiah as the angel and agent. One of the primary purposes of myth is not just to explain the past, but also the future. Myth is only truly relevant as a promise and a warning. The great burning star Wormwood, the planet Mars, lived up to its name. It caused a great portion of the waters of the earth to become both bitter and deadly. The red planet had done this before during the Exodus. After the crossing of the Red Sea and the destruction of Pharaoh's army, Moses and the children of Israel traveled 3 days in the wilderness, stopping eventually in a place they called Marah. They found no water during their 3-day journey. Marah had water, but it was bitter and undrinkable. The name Marah means bitter in the Hebrew. Predictably, the Israelites were not happy and complained to Moses, who in turn asked assistance from the Lord. The Lord healed the waters and promised that if the Israelites obeyed his commandments, they would be spared from the plagues inflicted upon the Egyptians. Eventually, the Israelites left Marah and encamped in Elim, which was well watered. Biblical scholars, as is their custom, seek explanations of the miraculous events of the Exodus in the natural world. This is true of the Lord's healing of the waters of Marah with a tree. Their preferred explanation involves trees known for their ability to sweeten water. There are such trees, but none are to be found along the assumed route of the Israelites or at the proposed site of Marah. Moreover, a single tree with the power to heal water could not possibly have sweetened enough water at Marah to meet the needs of the entire camp of Israel. The healing of the waters was clearly supernatural. The miracle of healing enough water for the estimated millions of Israelites and their herds through the use of one tree exceeds the feeding of the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Besides, this approach localizes the event. This contradicts the Mosaic account, which indicates that the plague of bitter waters was inflicted upon the Egyptians as well. The diseases brought upon the Egyptians included bitter waters. In reality, judging from the future parallel event recorded in Revelation, the bitter waters of the Exodus were a global plague. Hebrew scholars believe the tree used for healing was bitter and offer various proposals, including wormwood. Be that as it may, the identity of the tree used is not as important as what is represented. Using a tree to heal water is a form of magic, which, generally speaking, is the art of obtaining supernatural effects. We know that Moses and Aaron were magicians, as they ably demonstrated in their battle with Pharaoh's magicians. In the case of the waters of Marah, Moses used a different magical agent, known as a charm or amulet. Instead of the rod of Aaron, he used a tree. Behind the magic of the tree, and indeed all forms of magic, is the symbolism of the planetary archetypes. All magic and magical agents have a symbolic connection with the forms of the polar configuration. Aaron's magic serpent rod, as we have demonstrated elsewhere, was a form of the mythic caduceus. The caduceus was patterned after the axis mundi. This cosmic axis consisted of an alignment of 3 planets, Saturn, Venus, and Mars, with a visible mountain-like pillar descending from Mars to Earth. The axis mundi represented much more than the caduceus. The imagery of the axis in the ancient world included thousands of variations, including mountains, pillars, ladders, steeples, towers, and importantly for our discussion, trees. In fact, it was called the world tree. This means that the axis mundi was the celestial origin of Aaron's rod and Moses' healing tree. The tree that healed the waters of Marah was more than a magical agent. The Lord used the tree and its curative powers to create a symbolic covenant. But why use a tree healing bitter water to define the covenant? The answer is simple. The Hebrew version of the axis mundi as a tree is the tree of life. The tree of life has healing and restorative powers, giving everlasting life to the righteous. The tree of life is symbolically associated with a pure river or fountain, which also has the power over life, as Nephi came to understand from his father's dream. Both the waters and the tree represent the love of God. When the events of the Second Coming reach completion, the Axis Mundi will be fully restored. With that restoration, its archetypes will be re-established, including the Tree of Life and the pure river of living waters, which will heal the nations. The sweetened or healed waters of Marah, giving needed refreshment to the parched Israelites, served as a symbolic type for the life-giving power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Israelites had been given new life after wandering in the waterless wilderness, which represented sin and its bitter consequences. The covenant established by the Lord at Marah explicitly connected the keeping of His commandments with the true source of the healing power, the Lord Himself. Jesus Christ repeated the symbolic lesson of the waters of Marah with a woman of Samaria, drawing water from Jacob's well. The Savior's thirst was substituted for Israel's wandering in the wilderness without water. The bitter waters of Marah became the limited sustaining power of the well water. Jesus Christ was the tree and the purified waters, giving life to the Israelites at Marah and the woman at the well, and, in the gospel sense, eternal life to all those who drank of His gospel. The Mosaic account records that the name of the waters, Marah, was given due to this bitterness. Marah in Hebrew is derived from mar or marer, which means bitter. But the Hebrew root mar has deeper meaning and points to the source of the bitter waters. When the Lord established the Passover meal, He required the Israelites to eat 3 specific items: a male lamb without blemish, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. There is general agreement among scholars that the bitter herbs are meant to represent the bitterness of living under the Egyptian yoke. The Lord doesn't explain His intent with the bitter herbs, but He did say that the unleavened bread was a remembrance of Israel's hasty departure. This would support the idea that the herbs are a remembrance of Israel's bondage. Which bitter herbs were to be eaten was never specified by the Lord. He only specifically required maror, which, in the Hebrew, means bitter things or bitter herb. Like the location name Marah, maror comes from the primitive root mar. The Jewish Kabbalah has a different take on the reason behind the eating of bitter herbs during the Passover meal. The herbs are related to the planet Mars. Those eating the maror were not to remember the Egyptian bondage, but the bitter taste of wars and death, both symbolized by the red planet. According to Vedic astrology, the bitter taste is related to Mars. Indeed, astrology in general believes that Mars governs the bitter taste. Yet, the link between Mars and bitterness, as the Kabbalah intimates, is deeper. The very name of the red planet, Mars, signifies death. This was the opinion of the famed German philologist Max Müller. Müller's opinion is supported by the fact that the etymology of the name Mars tracks back to the ancient Indo-European root mar, which forms the basis for numerous modern words related to death. In other words, all words derived from this ancient root have a connection to death. This would include the maror eaten during Passover and the waters of Marah. It also means that these same words have a deep linguistic association with the red planet. When the burning star Wormwood descended towards Earth, it not only made the waters bitter, it brought death to those who drank the water. The waters were not simply bitter to the taste, they were fatally toxic as well. Given that the source of these waters was the planet Mars, it is reasonable to conclude that the waters of Marah were also poisoned by the source, again Mars. The Mosaic account does not explicitly say that drinking the waters of Marah were fatal. The taste was unpalatable, causing the Israelites to grumble, but nothing more. But the Lord's covenant suggests that the waters were, in fact, diseased. His promise that he would not bring the diseases upon Israel as he had upon Egypt implies that the bitter waters were one of those diseases. The likelihood is that Mars, the planet of pestilence as well as death and bitterness, infected the waters of Marah in addition to making them bitter. Drinking the waters meant more than a bitter taste. It meant death. It was Mars that caused the bitter waters of Marah. The planet also caused the bitter waters of Egypt, as the Exodus account suggests, and throughout the entire globe, as Wormwood will do in the coming apocalypse. But to name Mars as the source of the bitterness does not explain what the physical cause was and will be. What exactly caused the bitterness of the waters? Among the laws given to Moses during the encampment in the wilderness was a curious form of trial, called by the Lord the law of jealousies. When a husband became jealous of his wife, presuming her to be unfaithful to him, he was required to bring her to the priest with an offering. The priest would then test the wife for faithfulness with the drinking of bitter water. The priest made the bitter water himself as specified by the Lord. The priest then caused the woman to drink the bitter water. If she was guilty, her belly would swell and she would be cursed among the people. If not guilty, she would be free and childbearing. For our purpose here, the importance of the offering lies in the bitter water, and especially in its manufacture and composition. The bitter water was composed of holy water, which scholars presume came from the laver in the tabernacle, though running water was possibly meant. The priest made the water bitter by taking dust from the floor of the tabernacle and putting it in the water. Biblical scholars are ready to point out the symbolism of the dust, but no one has explained why it was used to make the water bitter. Wormwood or another bitter plant could have easily been used. But there is a logical explanation for the use of dust. The dust used to make the water of the jealousy offering bitter is the same agent that made the waters of Marah bitter. The dust scooped up by the priest from the floor of the tabernacle was the same dust that fell in the waters of Marah and in Egypt and elsewhere in the world. Dust from the planet Mars. We know that dust was present in the 10 plagues, including the plague of lice. To create the plague of boils, Moses and Aaron took handfuls of ashes from a furnace and sprinkled them towards heaven. The ashes became dust, which caused the boils and blains on man and beast. There was dust everywhere in Egypt. The sprinkling of the ashes from heaven, which turned into dust, signified where the dust came from. The dust fell from heaven. More specifically, it fell from the planet directly above the earth in the heavens. The Lord was actually quite explicit that dust fell from the heaven during the plagues. As Israel was about to enter into the promised land, Canaan, he made a promise and gave a warning. If Israel obeyed his commandments, it would become the greatest nation on earth. Conversely, if Israel became disobedient, the Lord promised a repetition of the plagues of Egypt. One of these promised plagues would be a rain of powder and dust from heaven. The plague would be so severe that it would destroy Israel. Dust falling from heaven is preserved in a peculiar mourning rite, the sprinkling of dust upon the head. The practice is mentioned throughout the Bible, being a standard part of Hebrew mourning ritual. Joshua, for example, when he learned of the military debacle at the city of Ai, rent his clothes and put dust on his head. Job's 3 friends sprinkled dust upon their heads towards heaven when they learned of his misfortunes. The elders of Zion at the time of the prophet Jeremiah cast dust into the air so that it would fall upon their heads as an act of mourning. During New Testament times, when Paul recited his conversion story to the Roman soldiers in the castle of Jerusalem, they became incensed. They demanded that Paul be killed, taking off their clothes and casting dust in the air in outrage. Casting dust into the air and upon one's head in mourning is not limited to the ancient Hebrews. The ancient Iranians did the same, as the national epic of Iran, the Shahnameh, attests. Women performed the role of mourners in the Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony. Illustrations from the Book of the Dead portray them as patting their heads with dust. Sprinkling dust upon the head was also a part of Greek mourning rites as well. The Greek satirist Lucian recorded the practice in his critique on mourning. Homer, in the Iliad, writes that when Achilles learned of the death of Patroclus, his mentor, he filled his hands with dust and poured it onto his head. Professional mourners of India cover their entire bodies with dust. Among the Maidu Indians of Northern California, the men throw dust on their heads while the women cast it on their shoulders and back. In other words, mourning by casting dust into the air and upon the head was a global practice by the ancients. Though no longer practiced today, the ritual will return during the calamities of the Second Coming. John, in his vision of the future events, saw that shipmasters and soldiers mourned the fall of Babylon the Great by casting dust on their heads. Commentators on this practice are at a loss as to how to explain its origin. Ad hoc theories on its meaning and significance abound, but no one seems to know where it came from. The inability to explain religious practices, such as the sprinkling of dust on one's head, is understandable. The world, for good reason, has willingly forgotten its past and disguised it in symbol. Myths and ritual are the symbols man has used to hide the past from himself. The truth is that the planetary catastrophes were too painful to remember directly. Immanuel Velikovsky called it collective amnesia. Still, we do remember in the sense that we imitate and recapitulate the events of the past through the archetypes of myth and ritual. Dust was not the only substance that fell from heaven during the Exodus. Ash fell from above as well. Not surprisingly, it was ritually commemorated in the same way as dust. Tamar, David's granddaughter, sprinkled ash upon her head in grief over her violation by her brother Amnon. As in the offering of jealousy, the red heifer offering used bitter water. Instead of dust, ash was combined with running water and then sprinkled upon the unclean. Sprinkling ashes endured for centuries in ancient Israel as a sign of grief. even today, Catholics reenact the falling of ash from heaven on Ash Wednesday. Though it is more common to use ash to make a sign of the cross on the forehead, the original form was sprinkling on the crown of the head. There were many forms of debris that fell from above during the Exodus. In addition to the dust and ash, sand, gravel, and rock rained down on the earth. All of it came from the red planet. An obvious question arises: how was the debris transferred from Mars to Earth? Over 100 meteorites found on Earth to date have been identified as originating on Mars. The identification is derived from the elemental and isotopic compositions of the meteorites, matching rocks analyzed by spacecraft on the red planet. Current theory postulates that the meteorites were ejected from Mars by an impact of asteroids or comets, eventually reaching Earth after traveling millions of years in space. It is believed that only impacts by very large meteorites have the ability to blast rocks with sufficient speed to exceed the escape velocity of Mars' gravity. But impacts by very large meteorites on any planet is rare, and the chance of rock ejected into space eventually landing upon another planet after millions of years is negligible. After all, only a little over 100 Martian meteorites have been found. The Exodus and Revelation accounts speak of rock, dust, and gravel falling in volume sufficient to cover nations and choke rivers and seas. Clearly, what happened during the Exodus, and will happen again in the Apocalypse, are far different from presumed theory about Martian meteorites. A gravity-driven universe, where the only process known to be capable of ejecting rock into space is impact, cannot explain the Exodus or the Apocalypse. Another mechanism for ejecting material from one planet and transferring it to another planet must be in play.
Sir Isaac Newton was the first to state the law of gravity. Eventually, everybody agreed that gravity alone formed galaxies and stars and planets, and that gravity alone holds the universe together. Then we discovered a force 1,000 billion times more powerful than gravity. It is possible that the predominant force in the universe is not gravity, but something else.